Today's topic is the human side of recruitment. Recruitment remains a challenge despite studies that are showing, particularly in the US, but also worldwide, that volunteers are rebounding, volunteer rates are rebounding. We still see that finding volunteers to fulfill our organizational needs is identified as one of the top challenges among volunteer engagement professionals. Looking at last year's volunteer management report by VolPro, these are professionals like yourselves are often challenged to, when asked in open-ended questions, what's your biggest challenge in terms of volunteer management? Sorry, it seems like there's a lot of issues around sound, but I'm going to let our colleagues address that. So hopefully you're all hearing, you'll all be able to figure out how to hear just once, even though certainly I hope to share things that are worth hearing twice. But in any case, um, when asked what are the biggest challenges in an open-ended question, the Volunteer Management Progress Report identified last year from a global community of your colleagues that recruitment remains the number one challenge. I also see that anecdotally as I work with organizational leaders across the US and Canada. And so, what can we do to overcome that challenge? I certainly think that there are lots of things we can do structurally. There are lots of things we can do technologically. But ultimately, when we think about recruiting volunteers, I view this in two key phases. First are all the efforts that we make to get people to our proverbial doors. How do we do that? We can focus on more targeted recruitment. We can engage ambassadors, fellow staff members, volunteers to go out on our behalf so that volunteer engagement is not just on our shoulders, but volunteer engagement is something that we really share and empower others to help us with, whether as formal ambassadors or informally through peer-to-peer recruitment by staff and volunteers. I like to think about ways that we can kind of deputize our staff and volunteers, our donors, our board members to serve as talent scouts on behalf of our organization to help us reach not just those who are already in our organizations world, but also beyond that, tapping into their networks. So I and Better Impact have offered lots of webinars and resources on how to develop strategic recruitment plans that are often focused on this first phase of recruitment, getting people to our doors. And yet, there's a big piece of this effort that we talk about a lot less, and that is once they're at our doors, how do we get them through our proverbial door? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Research over and over and over again reconfirms that ultimately a lot of volunteer recruitment comes down to conversations, right? We may leverage technology to get people to our door, but ultimately it's a phone call or a Zoom or a conversation at a one-time volunteer event that is the key tipping point to getting someone to decide to engage or to come back to engage again. And once again, this doesn't have to be all on our shoulders as leaders of volunteers. How are you training and empowering your ambassadors or peer-to-peer recruiters to do so effectively? So this question of how we get people through our doors is one that we're going to be exploring today. And in the spirit of conversation, I certainly encourage you and invite you to leverage the chat and or the Q&A function. We'll be pausing halfway through for questions, and I'm going to be giving you some questions and some things to reflect on in the chat. So I hope that we will turn this as much as we can, given our technology, to a bit of a conversation, because as we'll talk about, conversation is that human side of recruitment. And that's our key for today, getting people through your door. This was one of the questions that we at VQ Volunteer Strategies were asked to explore about 8 years ago when we were invited to partner with American Red Cross to help develop and provide training for a volunteer recruitment strategy at Red Cross. One of the things in particular that we were asked to do was to explore a discipline that is incredibly well researched and also effective in getting people to do something, getting people to commit to something, talking to people, influencing people. Who is very good at doing that? Well, you might be surprised to hear the group we were asked to explore, or the discipline we were asked to explore, was the discipline of sales. Salespeople effective salespeople are very good at influencing people, getting people to shift from being a prospective buyer or subscriber to then committing to engaging in that act. So, what can we learn from that industry? And when I ask this question in a room full of people where I can actually see their faces, I start to see all of us mission-driven, nonprofit, public sector administrators getting a little uncomfortable and squidging around in our chairs because in our world, in these mission-driven organizations, we don't often talk about sales. And so it's not uncommon for many of us to get a little uncomfortable. It feels outside the realm of our mission-driven daily work. And I'd like to ask you, not rhetorically, you're welcome to put some things in the chat if you'd like. When you think of sales or selling, other than the word money, what's the first word that comes to mind? When you think of sales or selling, what's the first word that comes to mind? A researcher whose work we've leveraged and I'll be quoting, also asked this question in a very large survey. And I'm going to share his results. I ask this a lot, and my results in rooms full of folks like you often align with the research by Daniel Pink. But it's so interesting. I'm looking at some of the words that are coming up here. I'm not going to be able to read all of them. Thank you all who are providing answers, but it's interesting. The first few are very positive words: social skills, human, product, value, friendly. I have to say, a lot of things have changed. Pitch, service provider, chatty, helping. Well, I have to say, in the 8 years since I started asking these questions, this is the first time I see a lot of aside from one person, thank you, the one who put bully, that's often the realm that we hear. And when this research was done about 10 years ago, this is a word cloud, pushy. Now I'm seeing some of that. Sometimes it feels fake. So now we're getting to a little bit more of a mix, but I'm impressed that so many answers were positive. When Daniel Pink did this research, and in the majority of times I've asked a room full of folks to share their answers, this word cloud is representative of the types of answers that he got. Once we pull out the word money: pushy, sleazy, yuck. Barry just put in slick. So we're starting to see there's some representation of that. I love that many of you had a positive attitude. I'm not discounting that. But when done in a much larger survey, this is what the answers were again about a decade ago. Overwhelmingly, the negative words outweighed the positive words. However, these images, as I will share, are very outdated, and maybe, in fact, the world is catching up based on our relatively small survey sample today. It's going to be interesting to see if some of your ideas are outdated as well, at least those who had some of the more negative pieces about sales. The word cloud and the results I often get taken together reveal a pervasive myth about sales. As Daniel Pink writes, the pervasive myth is that sales is distasteful because it is deceitful. It's not so much that it's wrong, it's just outdated. In the old days, so to speak, salespeople had much more information. And as we know, information is power. Think of the stereotypical car salesman. Car salespeople used to only have access to details about pricing, options, what the dealership is offering. Buyers were often at the mercy of salespeople, and that makes it much easier to be deceitful. But then along came the internet, and with it, the democratization of knowledge and information. So now there is much more information parity. When I think about, I've been driving a long time, but I keep my cars a long time. I've bought 3 cars in my lifetime. The first time I bought a car, many decades ago, I walked into the sales floor, I sat down, and I was like this on the screen at the mercy of the information that that gentleman had at his fingertips, and I had no access to it. Fast forward 10, 12 years, I told you I would keep my cars a long time. 12 years later, um, and this was in the early 2000s, and I faxed information to car dealerships saying, this is what I'm looking for. This is the price range. Can you help me? So I had a little more information because we had the internet. I was able to look up MSRP, et cetera. Fast forward another 10, 12 years beyond that, and I sat down in the sales floor. The salesperson turned the computer to me because just with the power of my phone, I could double check any of his data. It was a real balance of power. So we have information parity, or at least close to it, which has really shifted the role and the opportunity of this salesperson. And thanks to those who are writing in that some of you have worked in sales and you weren't a bully, which is great. You overcame that myth, hopefully, and leveraged a lot of the skills that we're going to be talking about today. So, how does all this relate? We're not here to talk about selling or buying cars. We're here to talk about volunteer engagement. Information parity relates to volunteer engagement too. When I started in my career in nonprofits, working in museums where we were engaging literally thousands of volunteers at our large institution. Volunteers had to drive down, walk to the back, come into the museum, go to the back of the building, sit down and look through notebooks of volunteer position descriptions because this was a long time ago. Now, all volunteers need to do is pick up their phone and at their fingertips are thousands of volunteer opportunities. So that means that we have shifted our relationship, our role, and our opportunity as a volunteer recruiter, and that we need to really think of ourselves as part of this sales force. According to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, about 1 in 9 Americans works in sales. I don't have that data for Canada, but I would imagine it's relatively similar. More than 15 million people try to get others to make a purchase every day. And that number has remained stable since 2000, which is the period during which the information revolution really began. But this number is actually very, very limited. Millions and millions of others are involved in trying to persuade or move people to do something. Maybe not directly purchase an item or a service, but they and we are involved in moving others to acquire something, to part with something, to adopt an idea, or change an opinion, or, as we often do, take an action. Because there was little data on this, Daniel Pink commissioned a survey to find out how Americans spend their time at work. And in a survey of 7,000 adult Americans, he found that Americans are spending 40% of their time at work in what he calls non-sales selling activities. This includes persuading, influencing, convincing, teaching, coaching, instructing, and of course, in engaging. And that is what we do every day, inspiring folks to engage. So while research shows that 1 in 9 Americans work in sales, clearly so do the other 8 in 9. They too are spending their days moving others and depending on their ability to do it well. We are all in the business of selling something. So for a moment, I'd like you to think, and you're welcome to add some answers in the chat here if you'd like. Just think, how does your organization use sales in fulfilling its mission? Think about your grant writers. Think about leveraging partnerships. There are many, many different ways that our mission-driven organizations, our municipalities, our hospitals leverage sales. How do you, as an engagement professional, leverage sales? Nicole says social media. What's the message? What are you trying to get people to do? Ilsa says we tell our story and how we help students. So we may tell our story to inspire donors. We may tell our story to inspire more clients. We may tell our story to inspire, maybe I already said donors, but new partnerships. Melanie says we build relationships and plant seeds for when they're ready. Krista says recruitment posts on websites, which gets to our last piece, not just externally, but also internally. What and how do you sell to leadership or colleagues? So we've had these email marketing, building relationships, recruitment posts, that's all external. What are you selling internally as well? Impact statements and stats. Thank you, Melissa. Volunteer impact reports. Yep, Beth, great. Oh, Amanda, a sense of community, opportunities. Oh, Nicole, I love this. Lighten your workload. We are selling opportunities, buy-in for more volunteer opportunities. Tammy says, we are selling the opportunity to help our colleagues build their capacity beyond their staff alone, right? We're selling them to help we're selling our colleagues on the idea that they could engage a skilled volunteer to help in their program area or their operational area. Um, Ilsa again says, share the power of the volunteer to market our organization. Awesome. Oh, Barry, help me help you. We're going to get to that. I like that. That's a great lead in. So thank you. So how do we embrace that idea that Barry notes, help me help you? What are the effective non-sales selling techniques that we can adapt, pull, borrow from sales research to help us both build and perhaps influence our colleagues to engage volunteers effectively and also convert prospective volunteers who are at our door once we get them to our proverbial door, virtual or real, and actually make that commitment to engage. When Daniel Pink did research on this, and it's all in it's kind of not codified, but summarized in a book called To Sell is Human, he organized the different activities, the skills that he researched into two groups. What do we do and how how to be, how we show up. So I'm going to unpack these um, according to his categories. And we're going to talk about how they apply to volunteer engagement. So let's start with the how to be piece. How do we show up? And in this regard, we talk about it in I'm going to break it into three different categories. First is called attunement, being attuned to the prospect, paying attention to the prospect's interests, motivators, even body language, so that you can tailor your ask to leverage those things. The second is buoyancy. This is about acknowledging that recruitment often involves a lot of no's or not nows. And buoyancy is about the strategies to help us build persistence and not be bogged down by that. And lastly, there's clarity. This is about curating the information that we share, choosing what to share, how to frame it, and maybe even when to share it. And all of this is a great foundation for then the what to do piece. So let's start with attunement. The shifting balance of information that shift from information inequity to information parity has really shifted as sales and technology have evolved. And this has definitely led to some rethinking about power and studies of power. And the results of these studies, part of a larger body of research, point to a single conclusion that there's an inverse relationship between power and perspective taking. Power affects our ability to communicate clearly and effectively, and feeling powerful can often scramble the signals in our brain, distorting messages, obscuring more subtle ones, and impedes our ability to take another person's perspective. This is really hugely important when we're trying to understand how to influence people. Because the ability to take another person's perspective mattered less when sellers held all the cards, when salespeople, whether a commissioned salesperson like in an electronics store or a physician in her diploma-studied office, had all of the information. Their edge in information, whether it was the reliability of a clock or the experiences of a patient with Lyme disease, gave them the ability to command through authority and sometimes to even coerce and manipulate. But as the information advantage has withered, so has the power that that information once conferred. So the ability to move people now depends on the inverse. We need to understand the other person's perspective. We need to be able to get inside the head of a prospective volunteer and see the world through their eyes. And doing that well requires beginning from a position that goes against traditional sales presumptions. So even an organization like American Red Cross that has pretty good brand recognition knew 10 years ago it couldn't rely on its big brand alone to attract people and just sit on those laurels. They needed to instead, their team of now many hundreds of dedicated volunteer recruiters recognized that success depended on not on their being the one with power, but instead assuming they're not the one with power. The more we reduce our power and don't sit on our brand recognition, on our big buildings, on our cadre of thousands of volunteers, and instead tune into our prospect, the more we can leverage their interests and move them effectively. This isn't brand new to volunteer engagement. We've been talking about this in the field for a long time, especially as we have been exploring ways to diversify volunteer corps, to do more work with communities rather than for communities. And organizations like MAVA, the Minnesota Alliance for Volunteer Advancement, has been a long time leader in resources and research around how to build effective relationships, how to do work in partnership with communities, not just diversify volunteer corps for the sake of numbers reports, but truly to create equitable access for volunteers. And in some of their research, they talk about the importance of authentically showing up, listening, learning, being sure you can articulate why you might want to engage a particular community, but have that perspective be informed by the community itself. And when organizations do this well, it's much more than checking a box. It's instead truly not only asking for opinions, but listening for input from communities and being able to then adapt programs and volunteer opportunities in order to meet both a community's needs and the organization's needs. In fact, MAVA, I just learned this week, is launching a new certification program in equity and volunteer engagement. So there's a lot of ongoing research in this arena, and a key piece of that is tuning in to a prospect's needs and interests. MAVA talks about it a lot in their research in terms of large communities. I want to share a strategy that emerged out of Daniel Pink's research that might help merely in a one-on-one conversation with someone. And that is to leverage on a day-to-day basis the strategy of asking questions. Questions are really powerful. They're a window into understanding your prospect and tuning into their motivations. Additionally, and this is the part that I think is so cool, it can, in fact, be a tactic to help your prospect tune into their own motivations. So, what does that even mean? Let me give an example. It's a two-part question that was presented by Michael Pantalone in his work on influence. So imagine that you're having a conversation with a prospective volunteer and you've talked about what skills they have that they might share with you. You've talked about the volunteer opportunities and are there ways that that opportunity might be able to, meet their schedule and all of that. And you're ready to wrap up. So as you're wrapping up, ask a question like this. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 meaning not the least bit ready to sign up to participate, and 10 meaning I'm totally ready to volunteer with your children's library or your mentoring program or Main Street Animal Shelter, how ready are you to volunteer with the children's library, our mentoring program, or Main Street Animal Shelter? And you give them a chance to answer. And you can imagine that perhaps their answer is a 6, or maybe a 4, or maybe an 8. Who knows? But the catch is that I told you this was a two-part question. And I suspect that many of you, like me, would have a prediction of what the next question is. But if you're like me, you might be surprised at what Pantalone suggests we ask, because he suggests that question 2 is, why didn't you pick a lower number? Now, this group already surprised me a lot by having very positive attitudes about sales. So maybe most of you aren't surprised, but I will admit I was very surprised because this is the question that catches many people off guard. Asking why the number isn't lower is a catalyst. Doing so forces the person to begin announcing his own reasons for volunteering. The individual moves from defending his or her current position to articulating why, at some level, they want to engage. So that person might answer by saying, "Oh, well, I said a 7, but it's not lower because I really do want to make a difference in closing the education gap, or I know how much having a mentor can be important in changing a young person's life, or I know how the city needs volunteers to help address our homeless pet issues." And it's a really powerful process. Instead of putting yourself in the position of power, which is my often a go-to tendency to say, why didn't you pick a higher number? Let me solve all those problems for you. Instead, saying, why didn't you pick a lower number? Has them leaving the meeting, walking out the door, saying to themselves, here are all the reasons why I want to volunteer. And that, frankly, changes our brain chemistry. That helps catalyze them to make the decision to engage. So I encourage you to think about trying out some of those questions and also to train your recruiters, your talent scouts, your ambassadors, your colleagues to try out that question as well, because it can be really, really powerful. Let's move on to buoyancy. We do know that sometimes we're going to get a no, and it's just helpful. We're not going to dwell on this too much, but it's helpful to develop and exercise our explanatory muscles, our self-talk, not a phrase I usually use, because optimism is something that can really help us be more persistent. So, 3 questions to ask yourself the next time someone turns you down or says they're not going to come back. First, is this permanent? Is this a no or is it a not now? Good to explore that. Is this permanent? A second one is this pervasive? We have a day of service event, 37 people showed up. A couple people said they're not going to come back, but 2 of them said they would come back. So is this pervasive? No. There's a couple, many said no, some said yes. Great, it's not pervasive. And third, is this personal? Is this really about me or even our organization? Or is this about the reality that this was a student who needed to fulfill community service hours and they did that and they may not be interested in more? Or this is someone who's available during the summer but isn't available after that. Is this personal? No. So is this permanent? Is this pervasive? Is this personal? 3 helpful questions to just reflect on yourself as we handle the myriad of no's and continue to dig for those yeses. The last piece of how to be is clarity. With clarity, it's really about how we curate the information for ourselves and for our prospects. And Pink presents 5 different frames for curating information. There's one in particular, I'm not going to go through all of them, but you're welcome to look them up yourselves if you want. But the one that I think is most compelling and that I've seen relate to volunteer engagement most strongly and effectively is this last one, the potential frame, because our human brains are fascinating things. And one of the things that I find, again, just very compelling is that the potential to be good at something is often preferred over actually being good at the same thing. Potential is intriguing. Potential is more interesting even than accomplishment because it's more uncertain, and uncertainty can lead people to think more deeply about the choice that they're considering. And the more intensive processing our brains give, and that's required, that generates more and more better reasons why that option is a good choice. So what does that look like in volunteer engagement? Because it's all very sort of theoretical and not too abstract. Let's make it very real. Instead of saying we need you as a volunteer, what if we took a page out of encore.org, which is now called Co-Generate? Um, Look at this great ad from a few years ago. Join us. Find your purpose after 50. Stand up and show up for kids. Tap Encore Talent for your organization. And this is the one that I think is all about potential. Change the story about aging. What's that potential? That's a lot of potential that we can participate in changing the story about aging. Another organization from here where I live in Colorado, Boomers Leading Change, was an organization that engaged older adult volunteers. And one of their big messages was volunteering really doesn't encompass all you do. You become mentors and trusted advisors, a valued resource, and a respected expert. What is it that you can become by volunteering? How many of you, I'll ask this rhetorically, can can look at your volunteer recruitment messages and identify how it paints a picture of what someone could become? These messages about potential are very, very compelling. So to wrap up this how to be piece before we get into a little bit more about the specifics of what to do and particularly recruitment messages building on this potential piece, I just would like to share a couple questions to ponder and perhaps explore with some of your colleagues back at work. How can you tune into prospective volunteers' interests? Are there questions that you can ask? What are you looking for and listening for when you're having conversations with prospects? Buoyancy. How do you handle being turned down? And how can you increase that buoyancy by asking, is this pervasive? Is this permanent? Is this personal? And moving on from there. And finally, how can you evoke potential to prospective volunteers? How do you prioritize information and tap into that concept of potential to frame your messaging more clearly? So those are rhetorical questions. I'm going to pause for a moment and invite anyone into the chat or the Q&A to see if you have questions or reflections you'd like to share. We'll give it just a moment while maybe some people are typing, and I'll take a sip of my tea, and then we'll move on. And I have some information and tools on how to write a compelling pitch to use either in conversation or in promotion to get people through your doors. Looks like so far there's no questions, but I will. Can you get copies of the slide deck? Yes, I believe that Better Impact will be sending out a link for the PDF after that. And if I'm wrong, that will be corrected. But yes, we'll be able to send that. Great. Okay. Well, I'll keep my eye on the chat. And in the meantime, I'm going to keep moving along. And we're going to talk about what to do. When it comes to the what to do, Daniel Pink talks about 3 things in particular: pitch, improvisation, and serving. I am, well, I'll explain what they are and then, but we're really only going to be talking in our remaining time about pitch. Pitch is about presenting our case and the invitation. This is about intriguing someone enough to then take the next step, to click through, to learn more, to sign up, to have that conversation. Improvisation is about being prepared, but then being prepared to go off script and really turn this into a real conversation. I'm not going to dive into that much, nor am I going to dive into the serve piece because in sales that has a very special world in terms of inspiring more of a mission, and we're in the mission-driven business. So that's one that I think we can pretty much really check. Not that it's all about checking off the list, but we've usually got that covered. And I will share, Nicole says, just want to say, really appreciate the becoming piece of volunteering. So many people feel unappreciated or undervalued. So volunteering, they have an opportunity to be seen. I love that. Thank you, Nicole. Worth repeating for everyone. So we're going to talk about pitch today. Um, and And often we think about a pitch, like I think about it like a megaphone, like, right, we're going to say this thing and send it out to the world. But actually, that's a bit of an oversimplification. Oversimplification. A pitch is an invitation to have a conversation. They really are collaborations. And to share a little bit about pitches, I am going to actually share. Oh, well, now it looks like it might work. It wasn't working when we were in practice mode, but I'm going to share on the screen a very short video, get someone else's voice in the room for a moment. I'm going to share Daniel Pink talking a little bit about 4 pitches, and we'll share examples of those. I'll unpack them afterwards. So you should be able to hear, this is about a minute video. Here we go, 2-minute video.
Yeah, pitching has become enormously important. We're pitching all the time, and we tend to rely on the elevator pitch, which is not necessarily wrong. It's just a little bit dated. And if you look at the social science, you can find some more intriguing ways to pitch. That is, to invite people into a conversation about whatever it is you're offering. There's the one-word pitch, based on something that Morris Sacchi, the famous British ad man, talks about as one-word equity. When people say that word, they think of you. When they think of you, they think of that word. One-word pitches. Rhyming pitches. There's some amazing evidence out of Lafayette College showing that propositions that rhyme are actually deemed more truthful. They are more believable because they increase what's called processing fluency. We don't pitch enough with questions. We should be pitching with questions. There's some interesting evidence showing that when you pitch with questions under certain circumstances, particularly when the facts are clearly on your side, it's extraordinarily persuasive. There's another pitch that I really like called the Pixar pitch, which is where you pitch your proposition, your idea, your company, whatever it is you're trying to move people to do, and you do it in the form of the narrative structure of a Pixar movie. Pixar movies have a 6-sentence structure. Once upon a time, ba-da-ba-da-ba. Every day, ba-da-ba-da-ba. One day, la-la-la-la-la. Because of that, da-da-da. Because of that, da-da-da. Until finally, da-da-da. And I think configuring a pitch in that kind of structure is really, really effective.
So let me actually close that out. Sorry. There we go. So let me review, and I'm going to add 2 more, and then I'm going to share some specific examples. So this will start going a little more quickly. Pink talked about the one-word pitch, I'll add the question pitch, the rhyming pitch. He also, in other writings, talks about, let's face it, the subject line of an email is a pitch. Twitter or X is a pitch, and then the Pixar pitch. So let's share some examples of these. Out here in the western part of the US, Kaiser Permanente is a nonprofit healthcare provider. Their one-word pitch is thrive. It evokes so much. So I think it's a lot to ask of a nonprofit organization or a service-based organization. What's the one word that might sum up your volunteer experience? But some organizations might do that. Change, um, build, imagine, create. There's there are words that might be compelling enough to embody what you are looking for. I don't want to get too cutesy with rhyming, but I do think that it's important. Again, we're really talking about brain science here to recognize that when we send messages that have rhymes, it causes our brains to process more, and that helps things deepen and get scaffolded in our brain, including opportunities to serve. So many of us of a certain age still remember rhyming pitches like for Timex washes, takes a licking and keeps on ticking. I have a colleague who's a brand consultant. He says, without brand, you haven't planned, right? I did some work with the Wikipedia Foundation. Many of us look at Wikipedia for different reasons. We don't think about that as a volunteer engagement opportunity, but it really is. The editors of Wiki are volunteers. And one of the things that the Wiki Education Foundation does is engage professors, university faculty to assign research to their students to research and write entries that eventually go into Wikipedia or are applied to go into Wikipedia to enhance representation of science and women in Wikipedia. And so we did an exercise coming up with some rhyming pitches, among others, to write on Wikipedia. Some were very silly. Keep off Reddit, it's time to edit. Some were perhaps a little more again, kind of fun. There's no fee for WikiP, but it got them thinking and it got them, yes, some were a little funny, but it was great to be able to generate a lot of ideas very quickly. And it did eventually lead to another one, which I'll share when we get to the Twitter, the X pitch in a moment. Subject line pitches. Pink also talks a lot about the fact that when we write emails, e-newsletters, regular emails, we are pitching to people to actually click through and open it. And there's some guidance, some research on how to write useful and compelling and effective subject lines, either things that inspire curiosity or that provide useful information. So little guidance on that. You might want to dig into that. And then we get to X or Twitter. It used to be just, limited words. So things that it became a key way to advertise. 5 reasons your toothpaste isn't working. You won't believe number 3. That's a curiosity one as well. Writing ads for potential employers. But when we get to our friends at Wikipedia, this is what the Wiki Foundation, this is what they came up with. Like it or not, the world gets science information from Wikipedia. Part of their work in trying to inspire faculty to consider engaging their students in upgrading the level of science accuracy in Wikipedia is to overcome that common barrier that faculty said, I don't want my students using Wikipedia. I want them to be doing research in primary source material. But to finally hone in on a statement that says, like it or not, the world gets science information from Wikipedia was a way to cut through that and say, you may have ideas about how you want your students to do this, but let's think about the rest of the world. This is how the world gets information. So that was a really great pathway that started with fun little rhyming things and ended with a really great, compelling message. Lastly, we have this Pixar pitch, which Pink talked about. And this came from, it was sort of revealed by a former Pixar employee. And you've probably seen some of the movies. You can imagine how this storyline plays out with pretty much every Pixar film. Once upon a time, see if you recognize this, there was a widowed fish named Marlin who was extremely protective of his only son, Nemo. Every day, Marlin warned Nemo of the ocean's dangers and implored him not to swim far away. One day, Nemo ignores his father's warnings and swims into the open water. Because of that, he's captured by a diver and ends up in a fish tank. Because of that, Marlin sets off on a journey to recover Nemo, enlisting the help of other sea creatures until finally, Marlin and Nemo find each other, reunite, and learn that love depends on trust. So, what What does Finding Nemo have to do with volunteer engagement? I did this exercise with other organizations to write their compelling Pixar pitch about volunteering. And here's an example close to home for me that was very real. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful town nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains called Boulder, Colorado. Every day, people went to work, rode their bikes, grew some veggies, walked their dogs, raised their chickens, spent time with family and friends in the Colorado sunshine. Until one day in 2013, it started raining and continued raining for a full week. Because of that, water rushed down the mountainsides, rose up out of the rivers, and flooded roads and homes. Because of that, people were not allowed in their homes or back to their neighborhoods as their cats hid in closets, their dogs climbed onto roofs, and their animals were trapped. Until finally, rescuers from American Humane Association worked with emergency responders to go behind flood lines with their boats and their trained volunteers to search out and rescue animals, reuniting dogs, cats, pigs, even some lizards and chickens with their owners. And what a beautiful story of the Volunteers of American Humane Association being able to address this crisis. And I'm not saying that you actually print and tell the story with once upon a time and every day and one day, but what a great exercise to be able to paint a picture and work then with your marketing team to figure out how to best tell that story using the media that you have. So, as you think about pitches for your organization, is there a one-word pitch? That would be amazing. How can you leverage questions to engage people's brains in thinking about either on a one-on-one or even in more multimedia? Um, Oh, Larry, maybe AI Copilot can help think of a picture pitch. I think that's a great idea. You'll need to enter some information and see what it can do with a Pixar pitch. I love that. Maybe rhyming, maybe not. I think it depends on your mission. I don't know that we want to be cutesy with some of the difficult issues our organizations are designed to achieve. Subject line pitches, X or Twitter pitches, and of course, the Pixar pitch. So I want to make sure that we can have a conversation, and I already see some questions and others in the chat. So for those who might need to go, let me just at least share a few key takeaways to think about as you try to infuse more of the or boost up the human side of our recruitment efforts. When you're having conversations with prospective volunteers, ask strategic questions to help you tune into their interests and also help them surface the potential benefits of volunteering in their own brain. Speaking of potential, focus your messaging on potential. What can volunteering do to help your community reach its potential and also bring the volunteer into a new potential, a new reality from the experience? Develop and play with compelling pitches for different media and ultimately leverage improvisation. You know, we didn't go into it in depth, but I'll just say it's good to have a script. But if we're really listening in to our colleagues, we may need to be ready to go off script and continue to build off of that.